Welcome to this data analytics tutorial covering contribution margin analysis using pivot tables in Excel. The data set we are using for this activity is based on real-life data from a national insurance company. All data has been anonymized to preserve privacy. The full data set contains sales data for 2025. For this tutorial video, we're using a small 24 record data set. For the actual activity, you'll be using the full data set, so the answers will be different, but the process similar. The insurance types or data in the tutorial may be different than the full data set, but the fields are all the same. For this tutorial on pivot tables, we will be demonstrating using Office 365 Excel for Windows. Other versions of Excel may be slightly different. Excel for Mac is mostly the same as Excel for Windows, except for some small differences in appearance. Any notable Mac differences will be pointed out. Also notice that there may be many ways of accomplishing the same thing. We are just presenting one way here. By opening the Excel file containing the data set. You'll be using the Excel file provided to create pivot tables. Step-by-step instructions using the tutorial data set follow for each of the requirements for the assignment. The first requirement is to find and correct errors in the region and insurance type fields. Click any cell in the dataset. On the Insert tab in the ribbon, click the pivot table icon. Click OK to accept the default range of the pivot table data and to insert the pivot table in a new worksheet. Rename the new worksheet by double-clicking the Worksheet tab and typing Requirement 1. Next, we will populate the pivot table. In the Pivot Table Fields panel, drag Region down to the Rows box and Sales down to the Values box. In your pivot table, check the list of regions to find any error or errors. In our example, we can see that in at least one row of our dataset, Northeast is spelled incorrectly. Remember, this is a small tutorial dataset. In the full dataset, there may be multiple different errors. Navigate to the Dataset worksheet. On the Home tab, click Find and Select. In the drop-down menu, click Replace. In the Find and Replace dialog box, type the incorrect term in the Find What box and type the correct term in the Replace With box. Then click Replace All. Note for Mac users, be sure to notice that the Replace All and Replace buttons are switched in Excel for Mac. Click OK to close the message box from Excel and then click Close in the Find and Replace dialog box. Now we need to refresh the pivot table data to reflect the corrections. Navigate to the Requirement 1 worksheet and right-click anywhere in the pivot table. In the drop-down menu, click Refresh. You can see that the incorrect region spelling is no longer present in the dataset. By the way, if the Pivot Table Fields panel ever disappears, you can bring it back by clicking anywhere in the pivot table. Now we'll repeat the process for the insurance type field. Drag Region back up to the Pivot Table Fields panel list, and then drag Insurance Type down to the Rows box. Review the list of insurance types to find the error or errors. In our example, we can see that in at least one row of data, disability is spelled incorrectly. Remember, this is a small tutorial set. In the full data set, there may be multiple different errors. Correct the errors by following the process we just used to correct the error in region. Begin by navigating to the data set and using Find and Replace to correct the errors. Then navigate to the Requirement 1 worksheet and refresh the pivot table by right-clicking and selecting Refresh. Requirement 1 is complete. The data errors have been corrected for both region and insurance type. For the second requirement, we will be using the VLOOKUP function to calculate the variable cost and contribution margin for each policy sold in the dataset. We will begin this requirement by adding the variable cost percentage to the dataset. The variable cost percentage is in the variable cost percent worksheet. To get the variable cost percentage for each sale, we will use the VLOOKUP function. Navigate to the dataset worksheet and click in cell I1 and type variable cost percentage. Click in cell I2 and type the formula equals VLOOKUP parenthesis, H2, variable underscore cost underscore PCT, exclamation point, dollar sign, A, dollar sign, 2, colon, dollar sign, B, dollar sign, 246, comma, 2, comma, 0, close parentheses. Then press enter. Let's walk through the elements of the VLOOKUP formula next. After typing in the function equals VLOOKUP, the next part of the formula is a cell reference to the cell that contains the state type code in the dataset worksheet, which is cell H2. Next, we reference the range of cells in the variable cost percent worksheet that contains all of the state type codes and the related variable cost percentages. Notice that we have to insert dollar signs in front of the row and column references in the range. Those dollar signs prevent Excel from changing the row or column when the formula is copied. The next part of the formula is the column number in the variable cost percent worksheet that contains the variable cost percentage. The last piece of the formula is a 0 at the end. This 0 will produce an error code if there is no match for the state type code. Next, we move on to calculate variable cost. Click in cell J1 and type variable cost. Click at cell J2 and type the formula equals E2 times I2. Now we will calculate the contribution margin. Click at cell K1 and type contribution margin. Then click in cell K2 and type equals E2 minus J2. Select cells J2 through K2 and on the Home tab, click the Accounting Format icon. The default is 2 decimal places, and that is what we want. Now let's copy the formulas to the rest of the rows. Select cells I2 through K2 and then double-click the fill handle in the lower right corner of cell K2. Requirement 2 is complete. We use the VLOOKUP function to calculate the variable cost and contribution margin for each policy sold in the dataset. For the third requirement, we will create a pivot table to analyze the sum, average, and count of contribution margin by insurance type. Then we will sort the pivot table by sum of contribution margin from largest to smallest. For requirement 3, we'll begin by inserting a pivot table using the same steps for requirement 1. Click any cell in the Dataset worksheet. On the Insert tab, click Pivot Table. Then click OK, accepting the defaults. Double-click the Worksheet tab and rename it Requirement 3. Next, we will populate the pivot table. Drag Insurance Type down to the Rows box and drag Contribution Margin down to the Values box 3 times. Click the down arrow next to the first Values field and select Value Field Settings. Mac users, instead of a drop-down arrow, click the information symbol next to the first Values field. A drop-down menu will not appear. Instead, the Pivot Table Field dialog box will open automatically. In the Value Field Settings dialog box, for Mac users this is the Pivot Table Field dialog box, select Sum and then click OK. Your value may already have been set to Sum, and that's okay. Click the down arrow next to the second Values field and select Value Field Settings. Mac users, click the information symbol next to the second Values field. The Pivot Table Field dialog box will open. In the Value Field Settings dialog box, for Mac users this is the Pivot Table Field dialog box, select Average and click OK. Click the down arrow next to the third value field and select Value Field Settings. Mac users, again, click the information symbol next to the third Values field. The Pivot Table Field dialog box will open. In the Value Field Settings box, for Mac users, it is the Pivot Table Field dialog box. Select Count and click OK. Right-click in a cell in the Sum of Contribution Margin column and select Sort. Then select Sort Largest to Smallest. Requirement 3 is complete. We created a pivot table to analyze the sum, average, and count of contribution margin by insurance type. We also sorted the pivot table from largest to smallest by sum of contribution margin. For the fourth requirement, we will be creating a new pivot table and adding a calculated field for contribution margin ratio to the pivot table. Then we will sort the insurance type field from the highest contribution margin ratio to the lowest contribution margin ratio. For requirement 4, we will begin by inserting a pivot table using the same steps we used for requirement 1. Click any cell in the dataset. On the Insert tab, click Pivot Table. Then click OK, accepting the defaults. Double-click the Worksheet tab and rename it Requirement 4. Drag Insurance Type down to the Rows box. Click in the Pivot Table and then, on the Pivot Table Analyze tab, click the Fields, Items, and Sets icon. In the drop-down menu, select Calculated Field. In the Insert Calculated Field dialog box, type CM Ratio in the Name field. In the Formula box, type Equals. Then select Contribution Margin from the Fields list and click Insert Field. Next, type the Divided by sign and then select Sales from the Fields list and click Insert Field again. Finally, click Add and then OK. Note for Mac users, the Add button is located under the Formula box in Excel for Mac. Right-click a cell in the CM Ratio column and select Number Format. In the Format Cells dialog box, select Percentage with 2 decimal places. Click OK. Now we will sort the CM Ratio column. Right-click any cell in the column and select Sort. Then select Sort Largest to Smallest. Requirement 4 is complete. We created a new pivot table and added a calculated field for contribution margin ratio to the pivot table. We ranked the insurance type field from the highest contribution margin ratio to the lowest contribution margin ratio. For the fifth requirement, we will create a pivot table that shows the contribution margin ratio for each state. Then we will sort the pivot table by contribution margin ratio from highest to lowest. We'll begin requirement 5 by inserting a pivot table using the same steps that we used for requirement 1. Click any cell in the Dataset worksheet. On the Insert tab, click Pivot Table. Then click OK, accepting the defaults for the pivot table. Double-click the Worksheet tab and rename it Requirement 5. Drag Insurance Type down to the Rows box. Right-click a cell in the CM Ratio column and select Number Format. In the Format Cells dialog box, select Percentage with 2 decimal places. Click OK. Now we will sort the CM Ratio column. Right-click any cell in the column and select Sort. Then select Sort Largest to Smallest. Requirement 5 is complete. We created a pivot table that shows the contribution margin ratio for each state, and we sorted the states by contribution margin ratio from highest to lowest. For the sixth requirement, we will copy the Requirement 5 pivot table and add region to the Rows box. Then we will sort the pivot table to show the most and least profitable state in each region as measured by contribution margin ratio. To begin, right-click the Requirement 5 Worksheet tab and select Move or Copy. In the Move or Copy dialog box, select Create a Copy and then click OK. Double-click the Worksheet tab and rename it Requirement 6. Drag Region to the Rows box and drop it just above State. Right-click a cell next to a state in the Sum of Contribution Margin data in the pivot table and select Sort. Then select Sort Largest to Smallest. Requirement 6 is complete. We copied the Requirement 5 pivot table and added region to the Rows box. Then we sorted the pivot table to show the most and least profitable state in each region as measured by contribution margin ratio. That concludes this contribution margin analysis tutorial covering Excel pivot tables. This video was created by Dr. Wendy Tietz. Thanks for watching.